It's said to be the golden age of the documentary as the popularity of the genre reaches new heights. There are literally hundreds of docs to choose from on streaming platforms, and pre pandemic, many were performing well at the box office. But is that popularity having an impact on editorial integrity and editorial independence? Dr. Manfred Becker is Graduate Program Director in the School of Arts, Media Performance, and Design at York University. He's an acclaimed award-winning documentary filmmaker, film editor, and the author of Creating Reality and Factual Television, The Frankenbite and Other Fakes. Dr. Becker, thank you so much for taking some time today.
Thank you for having me.
You've been in this business a long time, for more than 30 years, long before anyone heard of a Frankenbite, and I think that's a great place to start. We're talking about ethics in editing. When did it become a focus of your interest and research, and how do Frankenbites figure in?
I was lucky to have an Academy Award winner as my mentor. His name is Peter Watkins, a British filmmaker. In the mid-1980s, we were editing his 14-and-a-half-hour documentary, The Journey, at the National Film Board in Montreal. I came to understand Watkins' critique of mass media as what he coined the monoform, the dominance of a single audiovisual language applied to the editing of cinema films and TV programs, a kind of standardized and rigid formula which emerged out of Hollywood, where spatial fragmentation, repetitive time rhythms, staccato editing, dense bombardment of sound, and lack of silence or reflective space dominate the screen. The Journey itself, as a film, was a polemic against how we measure time and how current audiovisual media contribute to people's feeling powerless against the economic and political forces that rule them. That was leading to a crisis not just for media, Watkins argued, but for democracy as a whole. And Peter pointed to picture editors as accomplices in creating that monoform. I turned out to be one of those accomplices because I became an editor. For the last 35 years, I've told stories about real people and real situations, wanting to bring audiences an insight into the human condition and provide them with a meaningful emotional experience. For all those years, I also lied the truth to achieve that. The process of reducing 40, 60 or more hours of tape material into a straitjacket of a predetermined time slot for television does create collateral damage, like the truth and ethical principles. I started to think after a while that I was playing close to the edge of ethical conduct and reducing a life, a character, or an argument with all their complexities to make it fit the space between commercial breaks. That was the shadow that falls between the intent, the documentary you thought you were making, and the reality of the marketplace. It wasn't until 5 years ago it came home for me. That's when I first heard the term Frankenbite. Have you heard that expression?
It was not an expression that I had heard before researching this interview.
Think of its etymology, Frankenstein and soundbite. At first, it existed in the world of reality television to create drama where none existed before. Let's give you an example. Sharon and Manfred live in the big house of Big Brother with cameras on us for 24/7. And we get along really well. That's very nice, but it makes for boring television. So the producer asked the editor to create some conflict. The editor takes Sharon's recording of Manfred, that really bugs me, and turns it into that Manfred really bugs me, simply by switching the order of 2 words. That's a Frankenbite. Not to be confused with a soundbite that just reduces a speech to a single statement for the news, but still stays truthful to what was actually being said. The Frankenbite just makes things up and creates drama where there was none before. Okay, I told myself, that's reality TV, that's not what I do. I was engaged in the serious task of documentary making, as some called it, a discourse and sobriety. But I would hear my documentary colleagues talk about 3-act structure and rising arcs and inciting incidents and the hero's quest and the 2nd-act curtain. The problem is that real life doesn't unfold in a neat 3-act structure. It's a messy dance with reality, with 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. See, a fiction writer can plot progressive complications without being constrained by journalistic principles. But what if the actual chronology of conflict ebbs and flows rather than steadily escalates? We ratchet up the tension to keep viewers engaged, but do we remain faithful to real events? And how do we stay true to the real when editors must contort the captured footage into plot turns and a climax? I started to wonder what actually is the difference between a documentary and a drama now. And I had my own inciting incident while working as an external reader for the Canadian Media Fund. This is where hopeful applicants sent in their drama scripts and documentary treatments to be evaluated for possible funding. To do my job as evaluator, I received 2 sets of criteria, one for documentaries, the other one for fiction. One reads theme, character, plot, structure, pace, stakes, originality, entertainment, market. The second reads controlling idea, structure, character, conflict, physical quest, emotional quest, opposing forces, stakes, target market. So Sharon, you tell me which one is for documentary and which one is for fiction?
You can see that there is certainly an issue that is arising. Do we even think that our consumers, people who are consuming this, know the difference?
Well, I certainly didn't know the difference at that point. And I went back to them and saying, how am I supposed to make up an evaluation if I don't even know what you mean by what constitutes a documentary and a drama? And in general, if the genres become so interchangeable now, dominated by this narrative paradigm, my question became, has the Frankenbite that's common in reality TV already entered the world of fact-based programs? And I started to look at my own work. Words matter. I was doing a project with Daniel Libeskind, a world-renowned architect, and Ed Butinsky, the celebrated Canadian photographer. I asked Libeskind what inspired him. Books, he replied. Oh, I responded, the word made stone. And Libeskind thought for a moment and then said, yeah, it's something made stone. Back in the edit room, I thought, something made stone? That says nothing. So I looked for a replacement. Libeskind didn't use the word word in his interview, but I found a language. So I replaced the something with language, and it became language made stone. I still remember I was quite pleased with myself. It sounded right and it captured the spirit of our conversation. But still, something didn't sit well with me. Why wouldn't he say that word? So I researched further and found a quote by Albert Speer, who was Hitler's architect, who once said that his task in life was to turn Hitler's words into stone. Daniel Libeskind is a child of Holocaust survivors. And that's why he wouldn't say the word. He knew that quote. So I realized at that point that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And also I've been outed by a lawyer who was a protagonist in the documentary on the sex trade I edited. The barrister didn't like the bias of the documentary when he saw it. So he got a hold of the transcript of his full interview and compared it to the way how I edited his statements. And then in an open 50-page letter, the lawyer made a very convincing case about the way editing had reduced him to be the documentary's villain. And he was right. It was the filmmaker's bias who did that. So what does fact-based media actually mean anymore? Do we just tell each other stories?
Well, you interviewed some 75 editors while researching your book. What did you find, or did you find anything surprising? Or did you find anything revealing around this dilemma of editorial decision-making?
There were a number of surprises. Despite concerns that editors might refuse to speak to me about their day-to-day experience because of non-disclosure agreements, only one declined to be interviewed. They did agree that reality television now has influenced the way documentaries are being constructed. But many recoiled at my suggestion that that might pose a problem by proclaiming, what's wrong with entertainment? There was a degree of genre confusion. A number of editors described the work they were doing was on documentaries, even though the programs they were editing were classified as reality television. Those editors kept arguing that the recorded events did take place with real people doing real things in real situations, and that constitutes a documentary, right? I asked them if they consider themselves artists or craftspeople. Many insisted they were the former, meaning artist, and claimed creative agency, even though the hierarchical structure of the television and film industry dictates otherwise. As an editor, you're really not on top of the food chain. Editors also told me that broadcasters in Canada assume that literacy of their audience is at a grade 8 level. In the US, it's on grade 3.
Wow.
More than a third of the editors I interviewed told me that trying to explain what they do for a living to family and friends was a futile exercise because audiences generally don't care about understanding television. Do you think that's a problem, I asked. Most thought, no, it wasn't. And they didn't want to explain away the mystique of editing. See, editing is called the invisible art. The editor's aim is to have their work go unnoticed. Editors hide their creativity, even though their input is central in the creative process. I asked them about ethics in the cutting room and how they were defining that. Some had none and argued they did what needs doing. Others referred to their religion or their role as citizens in society. No one spoke of Kant's categorical imperative, but many referred to ethical boundaries they would not cross. I would say their approach was mainly utilitarian, making choices that would produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Yet most then also pointed to the production hierarchy that deprived them of true agency in their work. So there's a real conflict there. People are thinking and ethically considering people, but they were not willing to be able to put that to the test in the execution of the work. Yet not a single editor reported that they were ever fired from a job because they refused to edit a scene that contradicted their sense of ethics. They had their own ways of solving conflicts. They would cut a scene according to their own ethical standards instead of arguing with the producers, which is kind of a cheeky way to reclaim creative agency. You see, only editors view all the footage. Many would consult with colleagues on questions concerning the ethics of their work. There was a general interest in a professional forum that would guarantee confidentiality to discuss such questions, but many also rejected the idea. They said, no, the industry is way too small and competitive. I can't make myself vulnerable. Equally, few editors had any interest in formulation of a sort of ethical code as it does exist for professional journalists. They argued that prescribed guidelines would lead to moral laziness in making the right decision in the moment. Asked where they placed their main loyalty, most documentary editors named the participants. But when it came to show a cut to those participants and how they are being portrayed, which is certainly a meaningful way to express that loyalty, most editors argued that it wasn't worth the hassle or they weren't willing to open up that can of worms. And what was really strange for me is to hear that they preferred not even to meet the participants in person. Actually, some told me that they felt weirded out by the prospect of encountering the human being they had just gotten to know so well on the screen. So what was most intriguing for me was the dominance of story. Editors define themselves as storytellers. They work in a storytelling medium. They're editing the stories to others onto the screen. And in the process, they create their own stories to bring their work in sync with their own belief system and to overcome contradictions. They, in a way, applied storytelling to give those contradictions a narrative coherence. So I came to the conclusion that our changing relationship to story is at the core of the problem. We tend to think of story-based communication as commenting on the world, while we remain unaware how much of the world is actually made up of story.
Well, we have been telling stories since the beginning of time. It's part of the human experience, and certainly documentarians are seen as among the best storytellers. Are stories, do you think, being told in such a way to fit a construct of a proven formula? Is good TV being prioritized at the expense of sound, fact based reporting?
Yeah, I think there's a significant change in the recent past. As you say, and since the beginning, stories have been the primary way that we pass down culture, values, identity. Stories occupy a critical role in teaching cultural norms and values, focus our attention and form memories. We are all perpetual storytellers in and out of our lives. How many times have you heard, "So what's your story?" You go to a party. You can't be at a party without having a story ready to present. People have a natural tendency to want to hear them. Commissioning editors certainly want them. So it's in our cultural DNA to tell and hear stories. Somebody once said, "We do exist because we tell stories." It was the French philosopher Roland Barthes who positioned narrative as one of the great cognitive categories that allows us to understand the world. Without story to organize our experience, humanity would experience life as a blooming, buzzing confusion. However, now Western societies have reached the stage where stories are valued more than facts. Look, 74 million US citizens just endorsed a pathological liar for president for the second time. The rise of fake news is first and foremost a sign that we have failed as a society to teach our citizens how to think critically about media and the dissemination of information. Story has replaced brand in the corporate world. Story permeates all aspects of public life. The dominant economic forces have confiscated narrative and hijacked the imagination. It's now being used to sell product, ideology, and worldviews. Storytelling tags artificial narratives onto reality and blocks exchanges. It actually shapes behavior and channels the flow of emotion. Stories have become so persuasive that they have developed into a dangerous replacement for facts and reasoned arguments. Persuasive stories can spun out of false memories or into propaganda. People deceive themselves with their own stories. Viewers' reactions are no longer determined by facts and rational circumstance, but by a conditioned response to an emotional cue. A story that provides a reassuring explanation of events misleads by leaving out the contradictions and complexities which are natural to being alive. So overall, reason has been replaced by emotion, and knowledge is no longer a challenge to power. A sound argument is no longer the portal through which all content must pass.
Well, the lines have certainly been blurred between news and spin, fact and fake news. It seems like it's happened overnight, but has this happened over a long period of time?
I believe that technological advancements have greatly contributed to this blurring of lines. Stories used to be exchanges between human beings. Now society is delegating an ever larger portion of that essential storytelling function to mass media, and that mass media is to a large degree privately owned, and its bottom line is to deliver audiences to advertisers. And now there's social media, which is increasingly replacing traditional modes. Facebook, Twitter, and Google have become our dominant sources of information, and worse, are now the primary educators of our children. I thought about it. The Frankenbite is already so 2015. It's already not relevant any longer. By now, new technology is escalating the challenge. Adobe's yet unreleased Voco application will allow users to digitally manufacture fully formed speech by taking just a 10-minute sample of a person's voice to generate new and real sounding statements. And real-time facial reenactments, also called deepfakes, create on-camera statements that were never spoken. I suggest to Google Barack Obama speaking the words of Jordan Peele. Now, no audiovisual media can be trusted as authentic. As a result, audience must be empowered to decode the real from the dramatized. That's why we need media literacy.
As you say, perhaps now more than ever, given that editorial analysis is often seen as fact, not opinion, even within news programming. We talked about this a little bit. Do consumers differentiate genres, or are the waters so muddied now people just want to be entertained?
I think people have a universal longing for information about the reality that surrounds them. Our hunger is less for information in the raw, though, than for stories fashioned from it. We desire narratives, stories that make meaning, however dramatic, compelling, or paranoid they are. There was a time when genre distinctions of what constitutes a drama, a documentary, experimental made sense for audiences to decipher media. But through my own experience as a practitioner in the edit room, I've now developed a growing suspicion that mass media has long left those genre labels behind. Think about these new acrobatics we have come to, forging new subgenres like docu-soaps and soap docs and mockumentaries and docutainment and infotainment. Those colorful offsprings are bound by the limitations of their antiquated heritage. It could be argued that fact-based documentary and news reporting have become undefinable. And that tells me that those traditional genres could therefore be discarded altogether. This reveals to completely reorient the audiovisual world where the underlying forces of diversion and the appeal of performance determine the representation of reality. Which brings me to the book.
Well, and certainly the book has great significance to anyone who has interest in mainstream or other media. But who will most benefit from the content of that book?
I think there's a significant deficit when it comes to debating the field of audience reception. To be able to negotiate the media landscape, audience require a degree of media literacy, and that is currently lacking. I encourage you to ask your family or non-media friends if they know what a cutaway is. Some might point to the image of the nodding head of the reporter during the interview, but do they know why it is there? Okay, to cover a jump cup. That seems reasonable enough, but that's also the first lie. We are pretending a continuity of time where there is none, and playing with the real continues from there on in. I think that audiences need to have the necessary tools to distinguish conventions and expectations, which makes that media literacy necessary. In that respect, thinking in genre boundaries, what constitutes drama or non-fiction, might provide a starting point, a first grid by which to critically evaluate media. It's a format as a means, not the end. So that's why I think that media literacy is so critically important, more than ever. It has to be at the forefront of public debate to prepare and protect citizens from the power of technology to present fiction as fact. I think it needs to throw light on one of the most relevant issues of our time, this widespread distrust by society in fact-based media. I'm looking at this through a lens of a simple metaphor, applying media literacy as a vaccine against fake news, just as a vaccine will protect us from COVID-19. We as a world is currently anxiously awaiting for that needle to give us relief. Yet, just as urgently, we need to equip ourselves and our children with the tools how to contextualize and question media messages, so we raise a well-protected generation of digital citizens. Because I think stories now have become like viruses, they're contagious. We need to apply a more conscious awareness to the relationship to story that we previously took for granted. So behind the scope of the book lies a simple equation with the power to inspire a fundamental shift in perception. And that is, whoever tells our stories defines our culture. I'd like the book to help build media literacy, to prepare future generations of mass media and social media users to distinguish between real and fake news and truth versus falsehood. I believe that civil society needs to return to a trust in the fourth estate as a source of that truth. And in that, there's an urgent need to protect citizens from the dangerous property of story, or as a colleague of mine called it, anti-story. Without that turn, we'll be left with a culture and public dialogue based on assertion rather than authenticity, or claim rather than fact. All that would be left is perception. And perception is the handmaiden of forceful economic and centralized political power. That, I think, is a damaging combination, and one which is the world experiencing right now. I think the stakes are really high. I believe we are currently in a shift of a media landscape as dramatic as the transition from oral to written storytelling.
Certainly, so much to unpack there and so much tremendous insight. We so appreciate your time. Creating Reality and Factual Television, The Frankenbite and Other Fakes was e-released this fall, and it's set for printing early this year. Dr. Becker, we really appreciate your time and, as I say, your insights today.
Thank you very much.